Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Carlos Digital Channel. Been a while, but I think it's time to discuss some of the latest news, and particularly regarding Andy Muschietti's the director of The Flash. His comments regarding the Flash character. Something probably pretty interesting to discuss The Flash, the film, and his perspective on the movie, what I think about that, and we'll probably discuss a little bit the why The Flash failed critically and financially at the box office. We'll talk about the additional shortcomings that the film went through, and we'll talk about whether what he is saying is actually logical or makes any actual sense. Probably discuss as well a little bit potential or different versions of the Flash movie that were possible once upon a time, and we will conclude by making a conclusion on whether the Flash could or could not be an interesting character to the public. Let's start with Andy's perspective. Andy Muschietti, as you guys know, is a director that has directed, he's a Hollywood director. He's directed the It films, especially the first one, with particular success with New Line Cinema. He was brought in to do The Flash being a movie based on a DC Comics character of high prominence since the 1950s, 1960s. The film itself was anticipated. It has always been seen as a film or as a franchise that could be a box office earner because of a couple of things. One is The Flash has never been done on film before. The Flash is the nature of the character could present for interesting visuals, and it could probably bring you that action, sci-fi, big blockbuster type of movie. And there was belief that this could be a franchise that could bring something fresh and new, and it would be an earner. Certainly after Aquaman earning what it did, we'll talk about that later. But there was a belief that The Flash could be yet one more earner for DC and Warner Brothers. However, since then, the movie that they made came out, and it did not go well, did not earn well at the box office. And now, sometime later, now that everyone's seen the movie and that time has passed, you can see that the director, Andy Muschietti, has made certain comments regarding the film's performance, as well as older comments regarding the visual effects and the content of the film. Andy Muschietti has stated recently that The Flash failed at the box office because it, and I quote, wasn't a movie that appeal to all four quadrants. The quadrants being males and females plus and minus 25 years old. He further elaborated that in private conversations he learned that a lot of people just don't care about the Flash as a character, particularly noting a lack of interest from the two female demographics. To me, that is not a very interesting comment. I can see with concern that this may be the comment of someone who is signing up just to get paid, as a mercenary, essentially, to be able to deliver a film that the only reference they may have is that other comic book movies in Marvel make money, therefore this should be easy pickings. And the concept of the quality of the film, the quality, the respect for the characters, that's secondary to just getting the money. He's made some comments about DC Studios wanting these films to be for everyone and have the ability for you to bring your grandma into the movie. So to me, obviously, there's nothing against him. He is just a guy that was brought in to do a job, but this is not a person that understands the medium of comic books and the comic books as an art form, and does not seem to have a lot of respect for the characters to be able to say something like this and not expect a little bit of pushback. So we'll talk about why the movie failed in a second, but let's just go over some of the other comments that he's made regarding the film. Regarding visual effects, Andy defended the film's visual effects, explaining that the CGI was intentionally made to look weird to reflect Barry Allen's perspective when inside the Speed Force. He noted, the idea, of course, is we are in the perspective of the Flash. Everything's distorted in terms of lights and fixtures. This was meant to give viewers the experience of being in Barry's point of view. This, to me, feels like an excuse for unfinished and undercooked visual effects. Anything that had to do with time travel or the effects of the Flash doing his thing, they're very poor. And, whatever the reason was, this film should not have been put in theaters unless it was fully cooked and completed. And it was very disappointed to hear someone try to make that excuse. Regarding cameos, Andy discussed the extensive level of potential cameos considered for the film, stating that as long as there were DC characters, everything was a go, everything was allowed. But for phasing reasons, they had to shortlist the cameos, meaning that they were going to have a significant number of additional cameos. He also mentioned that some beloved characters from the DC's history, like Jor-El, Penguin, and the Joker, were cut from the final edit. Don't know how legitimate this is, but I do think that this is another point of concern with the mindset that the studios have with these films, that right now the trend is cameos. Cameos is the reason people go to the movies to watch this, and it's starting to become repetitive and difficult and removed from the actual storyline. It does seem to be working. Spider-Man Away From Home was a cameo-based movie. Deadpool and Wolverine was a cameo-based movie, but there is, I think, a limit to this, and people will get tired of this eventually, or some of these cameos are just going to be completely irrelevant. Additionally, Andy mentions that on adaptation choices, he explained that the film did not aim to be a literal adaptation of the Flashpoint comic arc, considering this is one of the good decisions made during the production. That part I'm probably going to disagree with significantly, because Flashpoint is quite possibly the most popular comic book story that has been made with the character, and certainly the original plans of the DCU when it was under the command of Chris Nolan and Zack Snyder and such. The idea was to angle this as a Flashpoint film, as seen in BVS, with the introduction of Thomas Wayne as a character played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan. So obviously these comments reflect Andy's perspective on various aspects of the Flash, and it is his opinion, but I am surprised to see him say some of these things, because he was awarded Brave and the Bold, and after the failure that this movie was, but at the same time I see him kind of make excuses and now point at the nature of the character and the popularity of the character to say the things that he's saying. And I think these comments are probably meant to protect his image, because he may agree that the movie is not a good one. There's no other reason to basically be saying those things if they thought the movie did what it was supposed to do. So there's still a giant question mark whether this Batman project is going to happen or not, as DC will allow the Batman 2 to come out in a separate time frame, and this puts Andy's film at a unknown delivery date, which could be 5 years or even more from today. So it's possible that Andy is seeing something, or understanding, or trying to get suspicion of something that might be going on, but it's unknown whether this movie is going to get made, because 5 years in Hollywood time is a lot of things that are going to happen between here and there, and it's certainly an unknown where this could happen. Now, the movie itself, it failed for many different reasons, but it had a lot of bad things going on it, and we should talk about them. Obviously, one of the main issues are the environment, the so-called superhero fatigue and market saturation. By the time the film was released, there was a perceived fatigue for superhero movies, which continues to this day. You're starting to see diminishing returns on superhero movies. Perhaps Disney themselves have saturated the market, and the subject matter, there's only so much you can do before you stop presenting something fresh and new. This is a hole or like a gap that the Flash could have filled, but it didn't happen in this case. The movie faced competition from other high-profile superhero films like Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which itself was critically and commercially successful. So it's possible that the audiences were being selective and not being convinced by the DC as a brand over the past couple of years, considering that the movies that came before this were received quite poorly. So there is that. There is the confusing narrative and franchise direction of the film. The film attempted to be a standalone story and a sort of pivot for the DC universe. James Gunn announced that the new direction for the cinematic universe was going to take place as soon as he took over, and this may have led the audiences to question whether this film was relevant, within the overall DC narrative or not. So the interest in the film was immediately diminished by not being clear, or the only thing that was clear was that this film was going to be the end of something that perhaps fans were interested in or were invested in, which is unfortunately something that would affect the film negatively. There's also obviously the legal and public relations issues with Ezra Miller. Ezra, who was the lead for The Flash, naturally faced numerous controversies at the time. These issues likely impacted the film's appeal, especially amongst certain demographics. the absence of Ezra Miller in much of the promotional campaigns and the marketing material or presentations in interviews may have removed some of the star power that the film needed, marketing campaign, and that could have certainly hurt it. I think there was some sort of enhancement. Nothing came out of these legal issues or public relations issues with Ezra Miller. Time has passed, and I don't think anything really came out of it. But in reviewing what happened back then, there was particularly one article from Rolling Stone magazine where it was meant to attack him publicly, saying things like he was saying that he didn't know what he was doing during the film. So I think there was maybe some foul play in that regard, and that definitely affected the film. When your star has some sort of problem or legal issue, the movie becomes a hard sell, and certainly that was the case here. The visual effects obviously are a major issue for the movie. The movie itself does not lend itself to be a high quality experience. There's a lot of criticism of the film's visual effects, and the visual quality just simply was not up to par with the expectations of the audience, given the marketing hype that the film had. Believe the hype, I believe, is what it was, and you end up being disappointed by going to watch something that just basically is not at the level of a Hollywood blockbuster. Like the film itself, the cinematography, and the direction of it was very poor, to be honest with you, and I can certainly see why some people are reacting against the comments that Andy made. There's also the audience engagement and the marketing behind the movie. The marketing strategy for The Flash was perceived as very ineffective, at least by me. It heavily relied on nostalgia with Michael Keaton's return as Batman, but certainly at this point is not enough to engage a broad audience or to excite the existing installed customer base, let's call it. Despite some positive endorsements from people in the industry, which still blow my mind, the film received mostly negative reviews. The narrative was criticized for being convoluted, too many plot threads and character introductions, and there was no real focus or emotional engagement, and critics and audiences alike felt that this movie had no ambition. The film seems to have gone multiple changes in direction in script and production delays, which may have affected the coherence and quality behind the film itself. They could have, there was a lot of news cycles based on where the film was at, the visual effects, and this may have affected the perception of the film before its release. And the reality, the film was hyped as one of the greatest superhero movies ever, and it set the expectations very high, something that they seem to be doing all over again with Superman. So the reality, they made this hype, and they led to a lot of disappointment amongst fans and general audiences who are expecting something groundbreaking. So I think the general idea is that the film just wasn't there. It was low quality, and that's something that is consistent that we've seen the past couple of years from DC films. They just don't seem to be bringing anything interesting to the table except just trying to copycat what somebody else is doing and doing it in a low level. So kind of disappointing to see what happened, to see the comments that are being made. But that being said, the movie itself had additional shortcomings. James Gunn, when he took over this movie, found himself stuck in a transition period where James Gunn, when he took over as a co-CEO of DC Studios with Peter Safran, made several significant changes to the Flash movie. James Gunn altered the ending of The Flash. Originally, the film was meant to include scenes with Henry Cavill's Superman, Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman, Sasha Calle's Supergirl, and Michael Keaton's Batman. However, these were cut under Gunn's direction to align with his vision for the newly rebooted DC universe, and instead the ending was reshot to feature George Clooney's Bruce Wayne, which was a last-minute change to potentially avoid to set up characters and to allow things to continue. That particularly with things that wouldn't be part of Gunn's new universe. Bringing Clooney was kind of anticlimactic and pointless. It didn't go anywhere, and it felt like they were just trying to remove something from the film, which would have been Michael Keaton's Batman potentially, but it was almost like a placeholder, but they just put something that didn't make any sense, and that really hurt the expectation of the film. When you go watching thinking that the DC universe, as you were seeing it before, was going to continue, you are told that's not the case, and you're presented something that never really paid off. Very, very weird expectation. James Gunn also clarified that The Flash was meant to reset many things, but not all things in the DCEU, indicating that the film would potentially serve as a narrative pivot, but not an absolute reset and no previous continuity. This would allow some continuity to breathe and continue while allowing for a new direction of DCU. This is extremely confusing and pointless, and there seems to be ulterior motive behind these changes, so it's very confusing as to why they would do something like that. James Gunn also ensured that cameos for certain characters were removed to avoid the confusion with his upcoming plans. For example, any reference to the Zack Snyder Justice League events were removed, and specific teases for characters like Keaton's Batman and Kelly's Supergirl were cut from the ending. So this basically set the incorrect expectations and maybe made the movie less cohesive and more open-ended than perhaps it should have been. The Flash didn't promise anything or hint at anything of any continuation of characters' storylines that weren't in the future plans. So the movie got caught itself in this weird space. Now, this comment and this idea that the Flash is not a character that could perform, that doesn't have interest, is giving me an impression of a focus exclusively on milking IPs, and that IPs have to be a certain way for them to be productive or for them to be successful, which is kind of, it's unfair against the character. You have the Wonder Woman films, 128 million for the first one, 166.4 for the second one. That's a COVID release, and it was released on digital as well, but you're talking about easily a $700+ million release per film. The Aquaman series, same thing, 1.14 billion and 423 million. That's an average of $780 million for 2 movies alone. The Suicide Squad films, same thing, 746 million and then 168.7 million. That's still, that's still significant. So overall, the average for all these movies, these are like secondary DC characters. It's, with all the shortcomings and COVID and all these things, if you add all these numbers I just gave you, you put them together, it's still an average of 580 million for what you would call B tier, C tier, or characters that are just being set up that the audience doesn't understand. The Flash itself made 266 million, leading me to believe that there's a clear disconnect with what Andy's Muschietti is saying and reality. This movie did not just perform below expectations. This movie tanked. This movie could not do the same thing that some of these other unknown or newly introduced characters did. So the idea that the film needs to have this sort of intrinsic attractiveness to the public is incorrect. You can build things up, and you create a good film and you can follow up with an equally good film, or even if you follow up with an inferior film, you can still get up and fix it with the third film. But in some cases that's not possible, like the Wonder Woman series. So the idea that these films can make movie, that the character cannot do it, it's incorrect, and it's unfair to basically say that. I understand, there's offensiveness and a potential reason to protect the director, especially if he's going to be continuing to direct DC movies, but this is the problem. You're burning IPs and you are hurting them to protect the incorrect decisions that you make. The Flash should not have been the movie that it was. The Flash could have been an action sci-fi thriller contained story that done that later on in the series, but there's too much going on that didn't deliver anything at the end. To say that this movie had no interest, could not interest anyone, presents to me a concern that of how directors and executives who are non-fans are looking at this movie, and B, what they want. He basically said, I want grandmothers to be able to go to these movies. Well, if you really look respectfully at the history of comics and who has been purchasing comics for the past 30 years, is not necessarily grandparents, it's adults. These movies, especially the DC characters under Warner Brothers, they would be better served by doing what they were doing before and not what they're doing now, trying to go for a mass appeal before focusing on the quality of the movie and on the history of the character. The Flash as a character, this is a character that has held his own in the comics in terms of having his own standalone series that continues to this day, and you have other films like Ant-Man, who does not have an ongoing comic book series, but yet was able to have a successful run with Marvel as the film. So there are many comic book storylines that could have been interpreted, or that could have been up to the film, as opposed to following this multiverse obsession. But the Flashpoint storyline is probably the most popular event around this character, and this would have boosted the sales of the film if this movie had been a Flashpoint adaptation instead of what the film ended up being. So in conclusion, The management of the DCU by its latest leadership was confusing, executed with apparent disregard for coherence, and communicated with even less clarity. The attempt to bridge the gap between the old and new visions of DC characters ended up failing both. The attempt to make the film accessible yet interesting also failed in both accounts. So it did a disservice to the character, and it continues to ignore the specific fans in its approach to reach for mass appeal. The Flash, with his unique capabilities, has long been recognized as a character with untapped franchise potential for DC, offering both visually stunning and dynamic action. However, the movie adaptation was just met with criticism, largely due to substandard production quality, including its narrative and visual effects, which failed to captivate the audiences and the fans alike. The director's remarks shed light on a growing trend in the industry, which is the prioritization of franchise IP exploitation for financial gain over artistic integrity. This insight reveals a concerning pattern where comic book movies increasingly resemble generic, repetitive action comedies that are just branded. They're overly focused on revenue rather than storytelling or character development. This approach not only undermines the artistic value of cinema, but also threatens the sustainability of superhero films as a whole, as audiences grow weary of formulaic content devoid of originality or even depth. The essence of these characters as modern mythology and the fans' connection to them seem to be diminishing in importance in the stakeholders that are capable of producing these films. And this connection to the subject matter experts, the fans, and the ideals of making a high quality production that respects the characters is now overshadowed largely by the relentless pursuit of box office success. In conclusion, Andy Muschietti is not saying anything that is beyond his opinion or what he's hearing from Warner Brothers, but it does bring broader picture into the mindset of how they're making these films, and this is why they're failing today.